Hey there, anthropologists. So today we're talking about logistical mobility and foragers, or the logistical mobility of foragers, and why it's relevant to you guys as non-foragers. So what is logistical mobility? Well, logistical mobility is, in summary, essentially pre-planned or pre-scheduled logistical movement of your residency. So when you decide to move, whether that's moving your home next week or moving your home in 15 years. So technically all of us are doing logistical mobility to different degrees and for different reasons. For foragers, this typically means you are doing logistical mobility based on the seasonality of plants or on the timing of typical annual flood events or wildfires, or perhaps around the seasonal migration of certain animals. Now, these are largely subsistence-based decisions, but these are not the only reasons that people move. People move for a plethora of reasons, including cultural significance and symbolic significance. So, for example, moving to locations and landmarks that are relevant to your culture. The people who built Stonehenge and Mound City, for example, no doubt planned seasonal occupations and visits to these sites independent of subsistence-related activities. But even within subsistence, there's still a lot of complexity. Louis Binford, for example, in the 1960s, tried to categorize these differences as a spectrum of behavior. He called them collectors and foragers. Quite confusing, I would say, but nonetheless, the spectrum of behavior tended to categorize logistical mobility based around whether you were a mobile forager or somewhat semi-sedentary. Sedentary being living in one place at one time. So for foraging communities, this meant moving to the resources that you were going to exploit when you needed them. So when you needed food, you moved to the food resource patches. When you needed water, you moved to the water patches, or water bodies, you could say. Whereas collectors would have a centralized base camp that they would harvest resources and extract them and bring them back to the base camp. Us in modern industrial society are more on the collector side of things. And you might be wondering how industrialized societies are related to these foraging groups. Well, the way we're related is essentially through the same process of decision making. How do we choose where we want to move? How we commute to work? Do we ride our bikes? Do we drive a car? Essentially in industrialized societies, we have a lot more options for our mobility and choosing when we want to move. Not to say that foraging groups don't have as much mobility, but generally speaking, we're talking about walking on foot or using a canoe. So those processes, or the underlying theory behind those decisions and behaviors, is what we call human behavioral ecology. And this theory, or body of theory I should say, is used by many anthropologists to understand human behavior not just in mobility, but also in human behavior in general, such as the mobility of people in cars. And one of the things to keep in mind is that it's not just about food, it's also about social relations. So when we talk about mobility, essentially this is the oldest conflict resolution in human history. If your neighbors are hostile and they want to hurt you, then you just move to a new location. But as Robert Kelly and others, citation included in the description below, as they have argued, these patterns in mobility and really in sedentism, so living in one place, tend to occur not because there's an adaptation or advantage to sedentism, but in fact happen because these people have nowhere else or an inability to move. So essentially, they're forced to guard their resources, to invest in intensive agriculture, and to invest in other types of intensive land use. Which, if you're able to move, you would just move because there's a lower cost investment in moving than there is in, making bows and arrows and things to defend yourself with. So essentially, their argument is it's not adaptive to be sedentary. It's the result of having no alternatives, and the solution being to defend your territory and to defend your resources. But I think we're getting a little bit away from the point here of logistical mobility. The whole point of logistical mobility is to examine how, when, and why people move, and what that can tell us about people's cultural preferences and things from subsistence to values and beliefs. And this can be asked from even a simple question of, do I drive to the convenience store or do I walk?